Well, thank you very much, everybody, for dialing in to see us. And now you can all see us on your screen, which is good. I'm Joanna Wootten. I'm chair of Transport for London Independent Disability Advisory Group. As we've already heard, we've got a very illustrious panel here, and I'm really excited about this because we're going to be thinking about how to make accessible smart cities. But we already know that one person is going to be a bit like a genie, spreading his magic and then disappearing off somewhere else, and that's Dr. Victor Pineda. So what I'm going to suggest is that we go straight to him now to make sure we do hear from him, and then I will introduce the other members of the panel. And I'm assuming that the other members of the panel will not be upset. You're not upset, are you? Excellent. Yay, we're a lovely panel. Over to you, Dr. Victor Pineda, please.
Thank you so much, Joanna. It's an honor to be here with TechShare Pro. This has been an incredible year for digital disruption. I want to bring three major contributions that we should all be thinking about. As TechShare Pro has already said, and a lot of the other speakers have noted, that COVID pandemic has accelerated the adoption of technology, but the pandemic fits within a broader trends that have all been sped up around the world, and mostly those are trends around urbanization, trends around the ways that we think about municipal financing, the way that we think about transportation, the way that we think about real estate, and a lot of the ways that we think about the built environment. My background, Joanna, as you know, is that I'm an urban planner. I serve at the US Federal Access Board. I helped develop the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. And currently, I serve on two global councils of the World Economic Forum, both of which have to deal with issues of smart cities, technology deployment, and just this future of urbanization. But the main idea right now that we need to contend with is people are moving into urban areas every week. That means that we have a tremendous amount of building, a tremendous amount of planning, a tremendous amount of design. A lot of that building and design will, for the first time, have digital infrastructure built in. I think the second important topic to remember is that if we're looking at the longer term push of urbanization, is that by 2050, the world will look very different. We'll have been dealing with climate change and disruptions in a variety of perspectives. But from the perspective specifically of cities, 60 to 70% of the infrastructure that we will need by 2050 has not been built yet. So 60 to 70% of the infrastructure that we need has not been built yet. So we're in essence more than doubling the number of roads and buses and schools and hospitals and homes. Technology is going to play a role in that. The question is, will persons with disabilities be invited to the table to shape those conversations, to shape the digital dimensions of those conversations? I'm really excited that two of my closest collaborators and distributors are going to continue on this panel, and that is James Thurston and Commissioner Calise, both of which have been leading efforts to incorporate smart city technology and to shape the way that smart city technology highlights our perspectives. So I think, in closing, we have made global commitments, as I mentioned, the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities adopted by over 180 countries. should guide these conversations around technology, around cities and municipal services. The UN Sustainable Development Goals, which again we helped negotiate and push forward targets, specifically as SDG 11 on inclusive public spaces and infrastructure, has targets on accessibility, and then ultimately the urban agenda, which happens. These discussions happen once every 20 years. We have 15 references to persons with disabilities. So really, you can't have a future that doesn't build accessibility, and you can't have cities that leave people behind. As James likes to remind us, and even Victor Calise, you can't have a smart city if it's not accessible. And Commissioner Calise also says, building accessibility should be a race to the top. Everybody should want to become the world's most accessible city. So with that, I want to just congratulate the organizers of TechShare Pro for bringing the urban agenda and the urban discussion to the conversation. It is the urban century. The decisions that we make now will have long-term consequences. And I wish you the best of luck. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you very much for that really excellent overview. I think it's, as you say, we're moving into an urban century, and it is really critical that disabled people are at the table shaping the agenda, making sure that the digital infrastructure is built in, so that is an inclusive urban century as well, and sustainable too.
And it's built by all of us, because cities that have something to offer and something to benefit by all the people that live in it. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I forgot to tell everybody earlier, in case you were wondering, that I'm white, middle-aged, with black glasses, which I hope make me look intelligent, pink jacket and a white top. Okay, that's really good. I'm going to now hand over to James.
Thank you so much. As a description of me, I'm also white and middle-aged. I'm wearing a blue business shirt. For those of you like Commissioner Calise and Dr. Pineda, who may have been doing a lot of calls with me, you've probably seen this shirt. I sort of cycle through the same 3 shirts over and over, so I apologize for that. I'm thrilled to be here and really talking about a topic that's near and dear to my organization's heart, the Global Initiative for Inclusive ICTs. And thank you, Dr. Pineda, for setting that up so well. World Enabled and Dr. Pineda have been really close allies and partners of ours as we've been doing work on smart cities. And the work that we do, we're an international nonprofit organization set up with support of the United Nations about 14 years ago. And we've got a pretty substantial initiative around inclusive smart cities. We focus on the digital inclusion of people with disabilities. And I think, as Victor was saying, we're really missing an enormous opportunity with this new century and this enormous in-migration to cities. We're missing an opportunity to be not just smarter, but also more inclusive. And so about 4 years ago, we launched an initiative called Smart Cities for All with partners like Microsoft, actually, World Enabled. We've done a lot of work with Commissioner Calise in the city of New York, and we even partnered with AbilityNet early on in the process to do a roundtable discussion focus group in London. But we know we're missing this opportunity to be both inclusive and smart as cities are deploying technology and using data. And as Victor mentioned, cities really are our future. The demographics are showing that about 70% of the global population will live in cities by the 2050, and in some parts of the world that move into cities is even more dramatic. In China, for example, if they were to keep up with the demand to live in cities in that country, they'd have to build a new city of 1 million people every week. And so this really is where the planet is headed, including people with disabilities, importantly. A part of that, and one of the trends that we see out there that's really influencing how we're working with cities is the digital transformation technology is advancing into all parts of our lives, including what cities are doing. Every city service is increasingly supported with technology and data. And what are the implications of that for people with disabilities in those cities? The market for smart city technology is around $2.5 trillion. Cities are enormous consumers of technology, and they're deploying that technology in really exciting ways. And I'll talk a little bit about some of that. But there are enormous implications for people with disabilities and older people who are either residents of that city or passing through that city or working in that city. And you see these deployments. If you think about it, I live in the city of Washington, D.C. I'm right in the center of the city, several blocks from the White House. And in my city, which is technically a smart city, the city's using technology across the board in everything that it does: transportation services, digital payments, citizen engagement, digital 311 systems, emergency preparedness and response, public safety, courts and justice systems. In all of these areas, cities are using technology to support those really critical services that we all rely on every day. In fact, and Commissioner Calise can maybe relate to this. A couple of weeks ago, we had a pretty substantial election here in the U.S. While we can't vote electronically yet, at least not in Washington, D.C., I was able to track my ballot of the city sending it to me, when it arrived, when the post office picked it up to take it back, when it arrived at the Bureau of Elections, and when it was actually counted. And I could do that all electronically. And I was checking that every 20 minutes, I think, just to make sure that my vote got in. So there's amazing services that cities are offering, but too often those services are not really accessible. Another example of a great smart city solution, I think here in my city, in Washington, is when the pandemic started here, the city of Washington created a digital dashboard for COVID. Every day you can get up and check, what are the hospitalization rates, what are the positivity rates, what are the positivity rates by my ward, just my part of the city. Again, all really important, critical information at a time like this, but that website, that dashboard is completely inaccessible. So there's real issues of making sure that these exciting technology deployments, these exciting smart solutions are also as accessible as they can be. We know that today, as part of our work over the last 4.5 years with cities, that today smart cities are actually making the digital divide worse, not better, as they're deploying technology, as they're using data. And that's something that collectively, I think we all want to work on. And there are some real defining characteristics, I would say, of what is a strong, inclusive smart city. And we've created a set of tools, and one of them is an evaluation tool of how we look at cities across 27 different variables that define how they can be both smarter and at the same time more inclusive, and really inclusive being a part of being smarter. So we're looking at things and working with cities on things like their strategic intent. Do they have a digital inclusion strategy? Are people with disabilities a specific part of that strategy? Is there a business case for accessibility in the city that goes beyond just legal compliance and risk avoidance? It really sees being an accessible, inclusive city as a competitive advantage. What's the role of leadership and budget, obviously, in the city in supporting a commitment to accessibility? We think a city's culture plays an enormous determining role in how good it is at being both inclusive and smart. So does it have a culture of innovation that supports inclusion? I think just a bit ago, you may have been seeing about Soundscape, which is a great example of innovative approaches to make sure cities are more inclusive in addressing long-standing barriers to inclusion. I know in New York, they've done some great work with data and LiDAR technology to understand the accessibility of intersections across the city. So that's a part of, we think, what defines an accessible, inclusive, smart city. A part of the characteristics of an inclusive smart city are its governance and process system. So how is it organized? Is there a commissioner of people with disabilities? Is there someone on point to make sure that technology deployments and developments are accessible? A named manager, or even better, a unit if it's a larger city. Does the city make sure it's only buying accessible technology? What does it do when it's buying technology and the vendor is not delivering accessible technology? Do they have processes in place for things like that? And is the city even doing an assessment of on a regular basis of how accessible its technology deployments are? Not just the external facing deployments for the public, but also for its employees. Cities employ a lot of people, including a lot of people with disabilities. And so it's really important that that those internal and external technology deployments are accessible. So I think with that, Joanna, I'll sort of leave it at that and just say that we know what makes an inclusive smart city. We know the factors that contribute to that. And now it's just sort of collectively pushing cities to be better at it.
Thank you, James. I think it's about making it a reality, moving it from being hypothetical to being real. And thank you for highlighting how that can happen. Since you mentioned that you work with Commissioner Calise quite often, it seemed quite natural, I think, for me to pass over to Victor to see if he would like to build on what you've already said. Can you turn on the microphone?
Thank you,
Your pearls
Joanna.
of wisdom were lost, Victor.
Thank you, Joanna. I appreciate it. Thank you, Tech Pro 2020, for inviting me here today. And thank you, Hector Minto, one of my colleagues and friends, for thinking about me to participate in this. I am a white male in black shirt and vest, and wearing glasses and graying hair. And our job in New York City is to make New York City the most accessible city in the world. And I ask everybody to hop on board, come and race us. We love competing, and we love the race to the top, because that's what is important, getting to make sure that our cities are accessible for all. And smart city technology is something that we've been pushing for some time. We've been doing a lot for things that are actually on our streetscape, things that are behind the scene with websites and social media. We've really taken it to heart, especially now during COVID. And we immediately made sure that all of our communications were accessible for people with disability, with sign language interpretation and captioning, making sure that websites were accessible. There are a lot of different information that was going out during COVID. There were forms that were out there for food delivery. There was forms for protective equipment. We had to ensure that all of that was accessible for people with disabilities. Along with that, there were tons of maps that James mentioned earlier that were being put out. And we had to ensure that those maps and those zones of where COVID was rising the most was accessible for people with disabilities. So we worked closely with our Department of Health and Mental Hygiene to ensure that happened. And we wanted to make sure that we communicated this with all of our constituents. We held weekly calls, Zoom calls like this, and Microsoft Team calls. And we wanted to ensure that the platforms were accessible. So we put a virtual guideline together. So for all agencies that were putting meetings together like this, knew how to incorporate the accessible features that people needed and are required. So along with that, we knew that online learning was going to be important. So we worked with our Department of Education to ensure that the platforms were accessible, to ensure that all of our kids with disabilities in our Department of Education, over 200,000 of them, by the way, had access to free iPads and free Wi-Fi, because we know there was a digital divide with that. These are the things that we moved during COVID to ensure that accessibility was at the forefront, and what the city was doing was fully and inclusive of people with disabilities, because we didn't want to leave anyone behind. And as far as smart city technology goes, I mentioned that we do things on our streetscape. We have something called Link NYC that's fully accessible for people with disabilities. And we did that through our procurement process to make sure things were accessible. We've had thousands of trips on our accessible taxis, and we're actually getting data for this on a constant basis, because there's a data deficit when it comes to delivering things to people with disabilities, because we don't capture it. We're capturing some of the data that's coming through all this. And we're working to ensure with agencies across the city that they are doing everything that they have to for accessibility, and private organizations as well. So public-private partnerships of what we've been building on for smart city technology. I know we'll get into things a little bit more, so I'll stop there, and thank you.
My turn to forget to turn on the mic. Thank you very much, Victor, for giving us a really helpful overview of what it actually means to be a smart city in practice, and also how you have to keep responding to changing times. Like COVID has been a new challenge, and thinking and really responding fast and trying to make sure that not everybody's included and not left behind. But I think that's probably easier said than done. One thing I'm interested in, Victor, what do you think had helped this to happen in practice? Is it having a role like yours available?
Yes, roles like mine are important. And in the United States, we have mayor's offices with people with disabilities all over. San Francisco, Los Angeles, Boston, Philadelphia, Chicago, Austin, Houston, St. Louis. So we make sure that we collaborate with those mayor's offices with people with disabilities around the country. And we've done a lot, and we're actually going to meet after this call today to go over the things that, the issues that we've been having during COVID and finding out best practices. And we started an Empowered Cities initiative with Boston, Los Angeles, Chicago, and New York and San Francisco to look at employment, financial empowerment, housing, and our COVID response. And we're going to be having a website that's coming out that's going to be live and updated constantly, so we could share that with other cities. And even we've been connecting with London as well, so they've been on these calls as well. And we're going to be expanding that network as we find more people throughout the United States and eventually an international platform. And one other thing that we did that's very helpful, that we've learned from specifically San Francisco on this, is to make sure that we have people with disabilities working in agencies across our city. We call them disability service facilitators, but they work in those agencies to ensure that everything that's being delivered, such as their services and their capital design and programs and their infrastructure, is accessible for people with disabilities. So mess with a national collaboration and making sure that people with disabilities are working on specific disability issues in those agencies have proved to be very fruitful for us.
Thank you very much. That's a really interesting overview. And I would challenge all the organisations who are regarding to this call today to think about, have you got disability service facilitators within your organisation? Are you connecting? Are you networking? And also, I would add, it's okay to share failures too. It's okay to share blips, because we cannot get better if you don't share the things that go wrong too, because we can only learn together. So on that note, I'm sure that Beta never makes mistakes, but feel free to admit them if you have, but also to share with us how you are facilitating our networking and changing and improving together.
Thanks, Joanna. I certainly tell everyone I don't make mistakes, but I think my husband and kids would probably suggest differently. But so just to describe me, I am a white middle-aged woman. I have black rimmed glasses on, I have red hair, and I'm wearing a teal coloured V-neck jumper because I live in Scotland and it is really rather cold here today. So that's me. I mean, it's great to hear everybody else speak, because I could probably really just reinforce a lot of the points that have been made, but I guess from the kind of that supplier technology provider side. So unsurprisingly, of course, at Microsoft, we believe that technology has a significant role to play in supporting accessibility in general. And in my role, I run our local and regional government business. So my team looks after all of our local government customers. So in particular, we see a role massively importantly for technology in terms of accessible smart cities and spaces. So, you know, we obviously provide the technology and the tools, and Joanna, you made an excellent point earlier about making sure that it's built in and it isn't an afterthought. And that is how we develop our tools. So our productivity tools have those accessibility features built in. And part of what we're doing now is actually going out and educating our customers on that. So, you know, my team, we kind of set out our priorities that we want to go and speak to local government customers about. And one of the key pillars in that is accessibility, is actually educating our customers on how to use those accessibility features and really rolling them out across their organizations. But actually, I think broader than that educating role, and I'm really, in terms of our technology, and I'm really delighted that actually our customers seem to be really embracing almost this education role that our team are finding themselves in. It is actually to help them to think about, I guess, some of the things that we've learned from our approach. And many of these points have really been touched on before in terms of, so actually, when we think about when you're developing your solutions, whether they're technology, whether they're physical, whether they're travel infrastructure, that actually you need to ensure that you've got the representation in doing that. It needs to be representation from the community of people with disabilities that can really help to make you understand and be clear about what is required for them, not just within your own organizations, which is massively important as kind of local authorities, but to help to try and facilitate the discussion with the citizen who has disabilities so that they can educate you on what is not working for them and what would help them. Some of what we do within Microsoft is really to sort of provide listening channels to enable people to kind of raise points, and we have bots that help to answer questions around accessibility features, and those are things that actually organizations could work into their own planning to make sure that you're kind of really getting that kind of voice. So we have lots of those sorts of discussions with our customers as well. I really liked, I can't remember who made the point, it might have been you again, Joanna, about kind of actually not being afraid to admit the mistakes. I think it's also making sure that you're giving people the confidence to complain almost, encouraging people to tell you what isn't right, to tell you what isn't working, and then to be really open-minded about that and not defensive. We've had instances where we've run events and we haven't had captions on right from the start, and we've had to have somebody call out, I can't follow this, the captions aren't on. Well, you can immediately go, oh, but actually just go, that's great, thank you so much for telling me, here's how to use it. And we can have that approach in kind of everything that we do. And I think, for us as well, we're starting to develop around that data point, James. I think you talked about data and the amount of data, and actually the opportunity to get really rich data from the Internet of Things as well. So we're starting to try and work with local government and partners to sort of build out almost like a city data platform to start to bring in some of that data and start to make it really rich. But that has to have an accessibility viewpoint. That has to have a sense of how that is going to help everybody to get around cities and to be able to utilize cities. And I think another thing that we really want to do is invest in innovators as well. So, we've heard about Soundscape, which is just an incredible sort of research project, and how much that has moved on. And what I really love about that, and I think is just a great illustration, is that is about a really rich experience. It isn't just a functional experience. So take this road, go down here, that's, there's a crossing there. It actually describes fully what's around you. And it's about really being able to live a full life within a smart city, an accessible smart city, rather than just a functional life. And I really think that is because that was developed by blind people. There were blind people involved in the development of that, so they would have a very different perspective to if I tried to develop something, apart from the fact that I'm not technical and it wouldn't be very good.
Thank you, Faith, for that. I totally agree about co-creating with people with different impairments, and it's about ownership as well. I think I talked earlier about mistakes, but there are different types of mistakes out there. There are the mistakes that come because people haven't bothered to collaborate or include people. Those mistakes I'm not as keen on, okay? Being clear about that. But I think you can co-create together and say, let's pilot this, but be open about it. You may not be sure it will work, but you're co-creating together. You're agreeing the risk together, and you're encouraging feedback throughout, and also acting on feedback speedily and quickly. I think it's really important. Victor, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I want to add to that. Yes, it's very important to engage with the community in the things that you're putting out there. And we found success in that. I'm going to give success in one area that I talk about, and lots of people have heard me talk about before, but some may not have. We were going through reinventing our actual payphone where you pick up, but that doesn't work anymore. So we came up with reinventing the payphone, which came out to this kiosk that we put on the street called Link NYC. And this kiosk, we, Mayor's Office of People with Disabilities, were part of this whole request for proposal process. So we helped write the standards of feedback from people in our office that had different impairments, and the disabled and the community as a whole. And what we came out with is talkback features that were that are on the kiosks, color contrast, braille, the appropriate height for people with disabilities. And as we started to grow on that, we as it got older and older, we realized that we needed to add more features. New York City just released the text to 911, which you can use on the kiosk as well. And one of the best things that I'm excited about, I don't know if anyone else is doing this around the world, is you can get a live sign language, American Sign Language interpreter on the streets of New York City right from that kiosk. And then we started figuring out, well, who's using it? And we know we have over 12,000 people that use it. That was in last year. This year with COVID, I'm pretty sure it's going to be less. But nonetheless, we know people are using this, and we're getting, we know what works, and we know the number of people that are using it. So then we could say, hey, there's a market here, because there's a market in this. And that's the reason why we got Microsoft behind this. They're not only doing it because it's right, because it's part of the business model. And those things are important to think about, and as we move smart cities forward.
Thank you, Victor. That's a really nice example of a success story. So talking about London briefly, I think I have a role with Transport for London, and I think it's quite a good example of them embedding working with disabled people, because there are 10 of us on our Independent Disability Advisory Group. We're paid to do this. We're not expected to volunteer. But they also have an engagement group. I know we're all talking about technology, but it's not just about technology. And I think it's important to remember that it has a role, but also you have behind the scenes technology sometimes too. So for example, for people, we have something called Turn Up and Go. So people can just turn up and at any underground station or whatever and get assistance. They don't have to book it in advance. So what TFR did was invest in the staff app, because they had better data, so they could track people and know when they were going to arrive at the station and so on. But that's an example behind the scenes technology that facilitates an in-person service. Also, talking about technology again, is that TFR has an open source data approach. So it shares its data, so any developers can use it, which is great. It had an accessibility forum a couple of years ago trying to encourage app developers to use the data related to accessibility, but it wasn't really getting sufficient traction. So TFR have ended up developing its own app, TFR Go, which gives detailed information that people need. We've all heard the expression, information is power. It gives disabled people that information so they can go, they know if they can interchange, whether they can change, whether there's steps, no steps. Also, it will, toilets, I mean, toilets are really important. I think both transport and toilet facilitate travel. And also the things like gaps, how big is the gap between different places, between the platform and the train. Some people need that information, other people need to know the quiet route, etc. The app is an ongoing development. I should say it's only currently available on Apple and Android version will be coming out, and it's being built to work with dynamic type, voiceover and landscape mode, and you've got the pinch and so on. One thing I like about it, it automatically shows you step-free routes. When you do journey plan, you don't have to hunt for it. It's included, it's mainstreamed. Victor, you wanted to say something?
So I believe, I love what you said about tracking the person so they know when they show up, they're able to get the services they need. I think that's wonderful. I think I want to talk a little bit more offline about what that is, because I think that'll be helpful for our Long Island Railroad system. And we've been experimented recently, the MTA, Metropolitan Transportation Authority here in New York, on a bus navigation called NaviLens. And we've been working, on the 23rd corridor, it allows people with visual disabilities to use NaviLens when they get into a certain area and find out exactly where that bus stop is. So we're testing this out now. NaviLens is, I believe, is out of Spain. So we're trying all different technologies to drive that onto our streets.
Because they do enable independence and for people to enjoy where they're living. We've got a question. So I'm really glad that there's somebody listening to us. We have at least one audience member. Okay, has COVID and the prevalence of home working influenced the existing modes for the popularity of cities over more suburban or rural areas? I'm happy to make up an answer, but I'm also happy to defer to my esteemed panel members. James, you're looking cheerful. Do you want to say something?
I don't know that I have an exact answer to that, sort of the in and out migrations due to COVID, and maybe Victor does. But one thing that I do want to say that we know is happening is that the digital transformation of cities and of society, but certainly of cities that was already happening, is just going, we're hearing from our partners around the world, is just going to be accelerating because of COVID. And so these issues of accessibility and of embedding people with disabilities in a more diverse user groups into the design and development and deployment process become even more important. And Joanna, you and Faith in particular, were talking about that aspect of innovation, and Victor as well, and bringing users with disabilities into the process. A while ago, about a year ago, we actually did a global study of innovation, inclusive innovation, and surveyed probably 200 entrepreneurs in incubators and accelerators around the world. These are the developers, the companies that are creating the next great, exciting smart city solutions. And very few of them were able to say if they had any idea whether or not their new solution was going to be accessible to people with disabilities. And so we're at risk of sort of, with this accelerating digital transformation as a result of COVID, in some ways we're at risk of falling further behind if we don't put in place some of these principles of more diverse and inclusive innovation.
Victor?
Working from home, we've certainly seen the acceleration of this. People with disabilities have been asking for this for some time, for this accommodation, and it's always been said no, but the whole world is being accommodated right now. So making sure that people with disabilities have access to it. It's easier in the city to be able to do that, to get Wi-Fi and to get the connected devices, but there are people with disabilities do live in poverty. So getting this, we have to be really cognizant of. And it's only worse in the rural areas of the United States. So the new Biden administration is talking about how do we get Wi-Fi out to these areas. And I hope at some point New York City really thinks about building a municipal Wi-Fi where it's free, easy, fast, and for people to get to, because I think that would be a game changer for everyone, especially people with disabilities.
Thank you. You're absolutely right about digital poverty and access. Faith?
Yeah, I think just to add to that, I mean, absolutely echo what Victor said in terms of we've seen like huge move to home working. And I don't know from the conversations that I'm having with customers, I don't know that anyone sees that we'll ever go back to it being quite the way it was before. I think we will have much more hybrid working. I don't see a wholesale, move out of cities into the rural areas. I mean, that was mooted, I think, when we thought we might be in this constant in and out of lockdown, because it was arguably a bit nicer to be in lockdown in the countryside where you could get out and about easier than it was potentially in a flat in a city. But I think even if we end up in more hybrid working environments, we shouldn't forget that there's a massive importance in terms of being in cities and being in towns to leisure activities, and I think this comes back to not thinking about smart cities as being functional, but thinking about it as being to actually live in for all of the aspects of life, not just so that we can enable people to kind of get back and forth to work. And I think there will always be a need for that, because we will, hey, I'm sure we're all desperate to try and get back together again physically at some point and enjoy some of these things. And I think that will always be required. And I wanted to just do one quick shout, because you spoke about technology, it's sort of smart travel. We have an AI for accessibility program that is about offering grants to help innovators to develop these things. And the next one, which is coming up, is specifically around smart accessible travel. So we'll provide those details, but we'd love to get more people applying with great ideas around that.
Thanks very much. I'm sure people will be very keen to hear about that. Can I ask people for their final thought? Because we've got to wrap up soon and finish on time. James.
Sure. No, I just want to echo Faith's pointing to that new AI for accessibility challenge. Actually, the city of New York and G3ICT and 4 other cities worked on defining what those issues are for the challenge. So I would echo encouraging you all to go take a look at that challenge and perhaps proposing some ideas for it. As a final thought, I think we're really encouraged with the interest. The kinds of conversations we're having with cities and governments around the world today are dramatically different than they were even a few years ago. It's no longer having to evangelize the idea of why cities should care about this beyond just getting sued. To much more, how can we work together, industry, civil society, and the cities themselves, to address in really creative and innovative ways, address some of these issues. And so I'm really encouraged, but I think we need to keep sort of pushing in that, as Victor says, the race to the top.
Thank you, James. It's good that the door is now open. Victor, can you turn on the microphone, please?
Darn. Thank you for having me. Hopefully we can design something where as soon as we start talking, it comes on. I'm excited about everything. This is the future is upon us. The future is now. The future is accessible. We just have to collaborate across organizations and nonprofits, for-profits, each other, build off ideas, and then really push hard. We have 30 years of the Americans with Disabilities Act. We haven't gone where we need to, and learning from others is certainly going to help us accelerate. So let's get to work. We got a lot to do.
Thank you very much, Victor. I think that we're all excited by the potential for living in more inclusive cities, irrespective of whether you have moved to the countryside or not. We're all still going to be visiting and living in cities going forward, and technology is going to give people choices to lead fully actualised lives. And I want to thank all the panel members for their really interesting contribution. And I'm really hoping that this is the beginning of synergy and partnership. Everybody out there who's been energised and enthused by today's conversation, please do think about getting in touch, because if we all share and collaborate together, the world is going to be a better place. Thank you very much, everybody, for listening to us, and good luck.